The year is 1942. A young US soldier stumbles along the lonely streets, the moonlight illuminating the neat pavement. Suddenly, he's attacked by a group of men, being severely beaten. But this young man isn't in some hostile country, but Australia, and his attackers are meant to be his allies. The Battle of Brisbane took place between the 26th and 27th of November 1942, and was a riot between American and Australian soldiers. Sparked by increasing US influence, unfair treatment of soldiers, and jealousy, the incident would result in the deaths of one soldier, with hundreds more injured. Today, we will look at how and why the riot occurred, and who is to blame for starting this deadly event. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the United States officially entered the war. It wasn't long before US soldiers arrived on Australian soil, to be better geographically oriented to the fighting. In February of 1942, the capital of the Northern Territory, Darwin, was bombed by Japanese aircraft. This caused the deaths of over 200 people, with hundreds more being wounded. On top of that, 11 ships were sunk, and over 30 planes were downed. This attack on Australian soil caused tensions to rise, as the threat of Japanese invasion seemed imminent. In March of 1942, General Douglas MacArthur was assigned Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the South Pacific. His headquarters were located in Brisbane. General MacArthur joined the US Army in 1903 and had previously served in World War I. In July of 1941, the Philippine Army was federalized, and MacArthur was appointed as Major General of US forces in the Far East. On the early hours of December 8, 1941, just a few hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched an attack on Clark Airfield. The Allies lost over 100 aircraft, and over 200 people were either killed or injured. The attack crippled the Far East Air Force, and was the first of many attacks all over the Pacific. MacArthur ordered defensive measures to be made, particularly on Luzon, a pivotal area for both logistical and political purposes. The defense of Luzon was in vain, and retreat after retreat was ordered. In March of 1942, MacArthur fled Corregidor via 4 PT boats, and arrived safely in Mindanao, before flying to Melbourne, Australia. Only 2 months later, the Philippines were successfully captured by the Japanese. In July of 1942, MacArthur left Melbourne to establish his headquarters in Brisbane, which had better communication facilities. In 1942, Brisbane was a much different place. In December of 1940, the population of Brisbane was only 335,000 people, compared to the 2.28 million that live there now. At the height of the war, 80,000 US soldiers were stationed in Brisbane, making a significant impact on the population. 1 in 5 people living in Brisbane were US troops, and over 1 million US soldiers would pass through Australia over the course of the war. At first, these new soldiers were welcomed, but as time went on, tensions grew between the Allied soldiers. Another important detail to note is how at the start of the war, most Allied soldiers serving in the Pacific were Australian. This led to disagreements between the American Supreme General and the Australian officers he controlled. General MacArthur's first major action as Supreme Commander was the defense of Papua New Guinea. The campaign would see important events such as the Battle of Port Moresby and the Kokoda Track Campaign, fought by an outnumbered and undersupplied Australian force. Under the command of General Sir Sidney Rowell, Australian forces were able to hold the Japanese just 50 kilometers away from Port Moresby. This valiant and brave act was not appreciated by MacArthur, as he believed that Australian soldiers lacked spirit. In September 1942, MacArthur relieved Rowell from his command, an act that many Australian soldiers found distasteful. After the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal, the threat of a Japanese attack on Australia were all but gone. This led to increased tensions as Australian soldiers believed that US troops were no longer needed to defend the country. Australians resented American soldiers, as they had better pay, nicer uniforms, and access to certain items. US soldiers were paid almost twice as much as their Australian counterparts. Group this with a more appealing uniform, which earned the respect of the local women, and tensions started to rise. Another hardship that locals had to face was rationing. Cigarettes, alcohol, and chocolate were all heavily rationed. However, American soldiers were given access to the American PX, or postal exchange. There, they were able to get luxury items at their regular price, without having to ration anything. It wasn't long before tensions boiled over. In the late hours of November 26, a drunk American soldier named Private James R. Stein left the hotel where he had been drinking at, and made his way to the postal exchange. On the way there, he stopped to talk to 3 Australian soldiers, but he was approached by a US MP called Private Anthony E. O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan asked Stein for his leave pass. While Stein was searching for it, the MP became impatient and took his pass before arresting him. This led to the Australian soldiers swearing at the MP and telling him to let Stein go. O'Sullivan then raised his baton, leading to the Australians attacking him. Soon after, more MPs arrived, blowing whistles and using batons. This resulted in Australian servicemen and civilians going to help their countrymen. Outnumbered, the MPs retreated to the PX, carrying an injured O'Sullivan and a still drunk Stein with them. Up to 100 Australians then surrounded the PX, throwing rocks and bottles, breaking windows, and fighting MPs. Small fights broke out across the city, and women were escorted out of the area for safety reasons. Shops and pubs were shut to avoid any further damage. By 8 PM, over 5,000 people were caught up in the riot, with some Australian MPs taking off their armbands and joining in. The fire brigade was called, but did not use their hoses as the crowd was too large. When MPs with shotguns started to appear in the PX, a sudden rush to subdue the weapon occurred. In the struggle, a shotgun was discharged 3 times, killing gunner Edward S. Webster and wounding several other soldiers. Multiple broken bones, fractures, cuts, and bruises were sustained by both sides. By 10 PM, the crowd had left, leaving a severely destroyed PX. Believing that the fight was over, neither side confined their men to their barracks. The next day, 500 to 600 Australian soldiers gathered at the American Red Cross, which was opposite the PX. At this point, the PX was under heavy surveillance, and was patrolled by armed MPs. On Queen Street, a group of Australian soldiers wielding MP batons were stopped by 20 US MPs armed with handguns. An Australian officer convinced the MPs to move to another area, to which they did. The crowd then moved to General MacArthur's office, shouting profanities and throwing objects. MacArthur was not in Australia at the time, as he was in Papua New Guinea. The crowd then spread out into the surrounding streets and beat any US soldiers they found. Over 20 US soldiers were injured, with officers, Australian MPs, and civilians doing little to stop it. By midnight, the fighting was over. In total, 1 soldier was killed, and hundreds more were injured. The units that were involved in the riot were moved out of Brisbane, and the PX was relocated. More MPs were brought in to maintain the peace, and the Australian canteen was closed. The MP that shot Webster was court-martialed by US authorities for manslaughter, but was found not guilty by self-defense. 5 Australian soldiers were convicted of assault, with one of them serving 6 months in jail. Due to the controversial nature of the events, details were heavily censored. The Brisbane Courier-Mail did publish a heavily censored article the next day. However, the nationalities of the soldiers were kept private. No US news outlets published any articles about the incident, and it is believed that US soldiers and reporters had their mail censored from any details regarding the riot. Smaller riots did occur in various places across Australia, such as Townsville, Rockhampton, Mount Isa, Melbourne, Bondi, Perth, and Fremantle. Tensions between the Allies soon settled down, and Brisbane was relatively the same as it was before the riot. Under the command of MacArthur, the Allies were able to take control of the rest of Papua New Guinea and assume control of the Philippines again. After the war ended, MacArthur oversaw the occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 to 1952. MacArthur was eventually relieved of his command during the Korean War in 1951, as his aggressive nature contradicted the peacekeeping operations in Korea. To this day, American-Australia relations are extremely close politically, financially, and militarily. The Battle of Brisbane serves as an odd reminder and often forgotten part of the war. The riot demonstrated how even between allies, differences and unfair treatment can result in violence. Thankfully, the two forces were able to work together and win the war, sparking close diplomatic relations that still last to this day.